Well, good afternoon. Edward Bonner sends his greetings. He couldn't be with you today, so I'm going to tell some stories. He never was a man to toot his own horn, unlike some of his Missoula Padres. If you've all been over to Captain Higgins, Mr. Bonner was more humble than that, I guess, more soft-spoken. He was more of a back scenes operator, and he was a lot richer than Higgins, actually. So if he was here, you would see a man, excuse me, a man of, I guess you'd say, quality, a man of he did not stand out in appearance. He did not stand out as a speechifier, as a politician. He didn't even make much waves in the press for being one of the 3 millionaires in Missoula in 1892. Bonner had two towns named after him. And you probably can guess which at least one of them was. I will point out that there is no such thing as a Higginsville that you know of, that I know of. There's no Hammond Town, there's no Hauserville, there's no big town called Daly or Clark. Bonner's Ferry, Idaho rose out of the ferry that Edward Bonner built with partners in 1864 to freight miners across the Kootenai River in northern Idaho on their way up to the Wild Horse gold mines in BC. The town of Bonner, Montana came about when, because of his connections with the Northern Pacific Railroad in the 1880s, Edward Bonner, who at that time was more known as a merchant, he and partners had started what became the Missoula Mercantile Company, which later became Macy's. They started that back in 1866. But his big money, his big influence in Montana and on Missoula came in the 1880s when he and his partners, including a guy named Marcus Daly, secured the timber rights and the contract to build the Northern Pacific Railroad from Mullen Pass over to Thompson Falls. To do that, they established lumber mills along the route. Basically, what now is an untimbered Clark Fork Valley bottom. That's because that was the timber that was used to build that line of railroads. When that was done in 1883, though, Bonner and his partners, again, by then it was A.B. Hammond was probably the main one, and some others that probably we'll never know, formed what was called the Montana Improvement Company. The Montana Improvement Company decided that this lumber business is pretty lucrative, and out of that arose the lumber mill, the stationary lumber mill that at the mouth of the Big Blackfoot River that has remained there ever since, and I guess closed down for good a couple of years ago. But that became the biggest lumber mill in the Northwest between St. Paul and Seattle, and between the lumber contracts and the railroads that Bonner and Hammond and several other partners built, Bonner became a wealthy man, a very influential man. But again, he was not the kind who threw his weight around politically, and was not actually a very assertive man to talk to, and so you wouldn't even. He seemed somewhat innocuous. It was my impression of what I've read about him, as opposed to the other movers and shakers, William Clark, Marcus Daly of that time, who were not afraid to throw their weight around. Bonner somehow kept his name out of the press a lot of times when there were timber suits filed in the 1880s, nationwide coverage of the illegal timber cutting on federal land. Almost certainly Bonner's enterprises were involved, but they were always under somebody else's name. And so Bonner knew how to, I guess, keep the heat away. A.B. Hammond was very good at attracting the heat. The three quick images I have of Bonner when I think of him. As a young man, he was 22 years old in 1856. Grew up in New York, and he learned his mercantile skills as a clerk at Lord and Taylor's in downtown Manhattan, which a store that remains there today. Probably some of you have heard of it. But 22-year-old man, he jumps on a steamship and he's going to head west. He's going to go to the American West, not like a lot of people did by wagon train. He was got on the train, went down to the Isthmus of Panama, jumped on another ship and sailed back up the west coast. Didn't stop in California. California was played out for a mercantile man. He went all the way up to Walla Walla, Washington, and from there he established his business. He got married to Carrie, who was the daughter of the first Idaho treasurer, I guess, treasurer of the territory of Idaho in 1865. So here he is on this ship as a young man coming to the country that he's going to change. A few years later, he's building his ferry across the Kootenai River in what's now northern Idaho, and around which the town of Bonner's Ferry grew. A few years later, he and his partners, Daniel Welch, Richard Eddy, they've loaded a 125 animal pack train with goods. They're shipping them over to Missoula, Montana. And there they establish an enterprise called the Bonner and Welch store that in years to come became the Missoula Mercantile, and as we know it now, or knew it now, as Macy's. That was the start of that store. So he's on a a passenger ship on the ocean. He's doing his ferry thing up on the Kootenai River. He's packing mules and horses and ox across from Walla Walla to Missoula. In 1902, his race is run. He's settled into the mansion that he built in 1892 in Missoula, across from what's now Hellgate High School. The mansion that was called a showplace of Missoula, or of Montana. It entailed an entire city block. The house and the gardens and the lawns were indeed worthy of what they called Millionaire's Row in that section of town at that time. 1902, he'd been having heart trouble, but he got a new gadget, a new way of transportation, means of transportation, an automobile. Now, I don't know how many old automobiles there were in Missoula in 1902. I don't think there were very many automobiles at all. In fact, this was probably one of the first automobiles. He was tooling around with it, trying to get it up and going. It was brand new, just gotten it. And the day before, on a Wednesday in July, he and his friend, Professor Morton Elrod of the university, were trying to get it going. And they thought they had it going. He wakes up the next morning, he's feeling pretty good, eats breakfast, has the car taken out to the street so he can drive it. Well, it's still not working quite right. He doesn't like the way it sounds or the way it's running. And so he spends the next 2 hours working on it some more and finally gets it up and going. He's cruising the drag around the streets of the University District, Gerald Avenue, Eddy Avenue, in that area. Stops at the Elrod home, which I'm not exactly sure where that was, but maybe somebody here does. in South Missoula, and tells Mrs. Elrod, you know, I don't feel very well. And a few minutes later, he stops again at another friend's house. I suspect, I haven't heard the full, I don't know the details, but I suspect it was the home of Arthur Stone, who became Dean Stone of the University Journalism Department. He was the editor of the Missoulian as well. Dean Stone is right here next door and his family. But again, he says, I'm not feeling very well. Gets back in his automobile, rolls just a few feet, falls out of the car and dies. The doctors later say that he was not killed in a car wreck, although our friend next door, Mr. Higgins, insists that it was the first Missoula automobile fatality, and he also insists that it happened on Higgins Avenue, which I dispute. And in fact, I point out that he has an avenue named after him. We've got a couple of towns named after us. He was a Democrat. We go back a long ways, but anyway, a couple days later, Edward Bonner finds his final resting place here. A procession of the Elks Club leads the funeral procession out from the top of Higgins Avenue, and he's buried. The eulogy, which was given back at his mansion in Missoula, was given by former Senator Thomas Carter, a man who Bonner and A.B. Hammond, one of his big partners, threw their political weight to get elected, and an election that probably prompted the War of the Copper Kings, but that's a whole other story. Then he was buried here in 1902. That was, I can't remember if I mentioned it here, but that was just not many weeks after his oldest son Charles had died in Iowa, and is buried here as well, as is Edward's wife Carrie, who he married in Walla Walla in 1865, and she moved out here with him to Missoula. And his other two daughters that survived to adulthood are also buried here. Bessie, whose name remained Bonner, so she may never have married, is buried there. And Lenita, who married Edward Spotswood, Dr. Edward Spotswood, in 1905, just a couple years after her father died. And they became pillars of the community. The Spotswood Mansion the Bonner Mansion became known as the Spotswood Mansion before it was torn down in the late 1950s across the street from Hellgate, and now there's apartments and condominiums that live there. So that's Edward Bonner in a nutshell. Thanks. How are you guys?